November 1945. The Rhineland lay in silence, broken only by the wind moving through shattered streets. Smoke clung stubbornly to collapsed chimneys, and the bitter scent of damp earth mixed with the faint tang of coal fires scavenged from ruins. What once had been towns were now skeletons, with cellars half buried and walls leaning like tired soldiers. Winter pressed harder each day, promising hunger sharper than any weapon. Inside a fenced enclosure, a group of German women sat huddled together, prisoners of war not by choice of arms, but by the fall of circumstance. They were not soldiers. They were not heroes. They were fragments of a nation undone. Their patched coats failed against the cold, their eyes hollow, their hands cracked from labor and neglect. Rumors whispered among them, dark as the frost-bitten nights. They had been told Americans would show no mercy, that cruelty was certain, that survival was fragile at best. And then, without warning, something strange unfolded. Across the camp rose the unmistakable scent of roasted meat, rich, heavy, warm. It drifted past the barbed wire, through the smoke and sorrow, curling into nostrils starved for memory. Turkey, potatoes, bread, a feast that should not exist here. Not for captives, not for the defeated. The women shifted uneasily, eyes darting, suspicion choking whatever hope flickered in their bellies. Was this a trick? A cruel performance to mock their hunger? Or had the enemy truly chosen to feed them? What followed that night would shatter illusions built by years of propaganda. Tears would fall, not from violence, but from kindness too heavy to endure. If you're drawn into forgotten stories where fear, hunger, and humanity collide, subscribe now to Requiem of Fear and comment below with your thoughts. This is only the beginning. They were not the figures of propaganda posters, not the shadowy villains painted with horns and claws. They were women, daughters, wives, mothers, swept into captivity when the Reich collapsed like a house of cards. In the ruined Rhineland, their lives had narrowed to rations of watery soup, stale bread laced with fillers, and the relentless gnaw of hunger that hollowed their cheeks and dulled their eyes. Each day blurred into the next, measured not by clocks or calendars, but by the rumble of empty stomachs and the cold that crept deeper into their bones. Some had been school teachers before the war, shaping young minds in classrooms now reduced to rubble. Others had worked in factories, stitching uniforms or assembling munitions for a cause they dared not question. A few had once been housewives, their lives anchored by families who now lay scattered across graves, bomb shelters, and missing lists. Their presence behind the barbed wire was not a matter of guilt or innocence. It was simply the fate of those left standing when empires crumble. To the soldiers who watched them, the women were puzzles wrapped in rags. Were they enemies or victims? Would they spit curses if approached, or collapse in tears? Many of the GIs had been told the same lies the women believed. That Germans were unworthy of compassion, that hatred should be absolute. Yet, as they passed the enclosure, they saw only hollow faces staring back, not with defiance, but with the weary resignation of the defeated. For the women themselves, captivity was a limbo. They were not free citizens, yet not treated as hardened criminals. They scrubbed floors, repaired fences, and waited, always waiting. What kept them alive was not hope of release, but instinct. The raw determination to survive one more day, no matter how meager the meal or how sharp the cold. At night, when the guards' boots faded into distance, whispers filled the barracks. They spoke of husbands swallowed on distant fronts, of children carried off by bombs, of homes reduced to ash. Some recited lines from Goethe or sang fragments of lullabies, clutching memory like a talisman. Others sat in silence, staring at hands that no longer felt like their own. But above all else, hunger ruled. Hunger sharpened suspicion, turned every unexpected kindness into a potential trap. So when the air thickened with the aroma of roasted meat that November day, the women did not smile. They stiffened, Their eyes narrowed. For years, they had been told Americans would mock them, starve them, and laugh as they begged. To be suddenly offered a feast was not comfort. It was confusion. Something was coming. Something neither their training nor their fears had prepared them for. It began with a rumor that spread like smoke through the camp. The Americans were preparing something unusual, something no one could quite name. The guards hauled crates from supply trucks. The mess hall doors slammed open and shut. An unfamiliar sense wafted through the wire. At first, the women thought it was only for the soldiers. A feast for victors, the sort of abundance prisoners were never meant to taste. Yet soon the whispers grew louder. The captives would be included. An invitation to dinner. The words alone felt absurd, a cruel echo of a life that no longer existed. For years they had lived under a rhythm of scarcity. Watery cabbage soup, bread stretched with sawdust, bitter substitutes for butter or sugar. Now the air filled with aromas they barely remembered, sage onions, roasted meat dripping with fat. Such smells once belonged to holidays, to kitchens alive with laughter and family. Here, behind barbed wire, they seemed impossible, even mocking. The women gathered in tense clusters, eyes darting toward the mess hall, ears straining for clues. Some muttered that it must be a trick. Propaganda had warned them. Americans would lure them with false kindness before humiliating them. They imagined being forced to beg for scraps, soldiers laughing as they reached for crumbs. Others wondered if poison might be hidden in the food, a final act of cruelty against enemies already broken. The guards gave little away. They moved with brisk purpose, setting up long wooden tables, arranging tin plates, lighting stubs of candles in glass bottles. The scene looked almost festive, and that in itself was unsettling. The women, wrapped in patched coats and threadbare scarves, could hardly reconcile their hunger with such abundance. Suspicion clashed with instinct. Their bodies ached for nourishment, but their minds resisted, warning them that no enemy offered kindness without cost. As the hour approached, the women shuffled toward the hall, boots scraping the cold ground. Every step carried the weight of doubt. Their hearts beat not with excitement, but with dread sharpened by years of indoctrination. They entered the room quietly, scanning for danger, bracing for humiliation. The soldiers stood nearby, serving trays in hand, some with stiff expressions, others with unease etched into their faces. Even the Americans seemed uncertain of what this night meant. The hall was no palace, but to women accustomed to ruin, it looked like abundance carved from another world. Rows of turkeys gleamed golden under candlelight, steam rising from mashed potatoes thick with butter, bread warm from field ovens stacked in baskets. It was more food than most had seen in months. For a moment, silence pressed down, so heavy that even the clatter of a spoon seemed shocking. Hunger roared within them, but their hands hesitated. Could this truly be offered without cruelty? Could the enemy feed them without mockery? Forks hovered above plates, trembling fingers clenched with hesitation. One young woman, barely 20, inhaled the scent with closed eyes, tears forming though she had not yet tasted a bite. Another, older and hardened, whispered to her neighbor, "If my husband could see me now." Her words trailed into silence, caught between shame and longing. The soldiers waited. The women stared. Suspicion and desire balanced on a knife's edge. In that fragile pause, history seemed to hold its breath. The first bite had not yet been taken, but when it came, everything would change. The silence was unbearable. Forks hovered above plates, hands trembled, eyes darted nervously between steaming dishes and watchful guards. Hunger gnawed at every stomach in that hall, yet mistrust held them frozen. Propaganda had warned them for years. Americans were cruel, Americans would starve them, Americans would mock them as they begged. To eat was to risk confirming those fears. A woman in her 30s sat stiffly at one of the rough-hewn tables. Her hair was tied beneath a ragged scarf. Her coat patched so many times it looked more stitch than fabric. She stared at the slice of turkey placed before her, its juices pooling into the dented tin plate. She had not tasted real meat in years, yet she did not move. Her mind replayed speeches, posters, whispered warnings. The enemy would not feed you. The enemy would trick you. Her hands clenched into fists, fingernails digging into dirt-lined palms. Across the table, a younger woman, barely 20, closed her eyes and inhaled. The smell of mashed potatoes heavy with butter drifted upward, carrying her into a memory she had never lived. Family tables, laughter, abundance. These belonged to stories told before the war, tales of a Germany that no longer existed. Her lips trembled, her chest tightened, yet she too held still. Then, quietly, almost defiantly, an older woman with gray streaks in her hair lifted her fork. Her cheeks were hollow, her eyes shadowed, but her spine remained straight. She speared a morsel of turkey, lifted it to her mouth, and chewed. For a moment her face gave nothing away. Then her eyes filled with tears. She swallowed slowly, as if afraid the taste might vanish the moment it left her tongue. The room shifted. A spell had broken. One by one, others followed. Forks clinked against tin. Hesitant bites turned into steady chewing. Silence gave way to muffled sobs as tears slid down faces hardened by war. They wept not because the food was extravagant, but because it was ordinary. Warm bread, real meat, butter that melted on the tongue. Ordinary had become miraculous. For years, they had survived on cabbage soup thinned to water, bread made with fillers scraped from sawdust and weeds. Their bodies had forgotten what nourishment felt like. Now, with each bite, warmth spread from their bellies outward, reaching fingers, cheeks, and hearts. The shock was not only physical, it was emotional, spiritual. They had been told Americans were monsters, yet here they sat, eating food served by those very hands. The soldiers noticed the tears. Some shifted uncomfortably, muttering under their breath, "It's just turkey." But they knew it wasn't just turkey. It was something heavier. Proof that the war had lied, that the enemy could be merciful. Kindness, they realized, was more powerful than bullets. Laughter followed, tentative at first. A GI cracked a dry joke about the bird being overcooked, and to his surprise, a ripple of laughter ran through the women. The sound startled them. For years they had known only silence, sobs, or the drone of propaganda. Now laughter slipped out, fragile but real. Not every woman embraced the meal. Some pushed their plates away halfway through, overwhelmed by shame. To eat the enemy's food felt like surrender, a humiliation deeper than hunger. One whispered, "If my husband could see me now," before burying her face in her hands. Tears of grief mingled with tears of relief. Yet the meal continued. Candles burned lower, plates emptied, and the spell grew thicker with each swallow. The Americans carved turkeys for women who had once been warned to fear them. The women accepted bread from hands they once believed would strike them. The contradictions were unbearable, yet undeniable. By the end of the meal, stomachs were full for the first time in years. And with fullness came confusion. If the enemy was capable of kindness, then what had all the hatred, all the sacrifice been for? As the women dabbed at their eyes with frayed sleeves, a soldier leaned toward his comrade and murmured, "We just gave them Thanksgiving." His friend replied, voice low, "What happens when they start to believe us?" That question hung in the air, heavier than smoke, heavier than silence. The first bite had not only broken hunger, it had cracked the walls of lies built over years. And nothing, not even war, could unmake that taste. The first bites had been taken, the spell broken, and now the hall filled with the sounds of eating. Forks scraped against tin plates, spoons dipped into steaming potatoes, teeth tore into warm bread rolls. What should have been an ordinary dinner carried the weight of revelation. For the women who ate, the meal was both salvation and humiliation. For the soldiers who served, it was both duty and unease. Tears rolled freely down hollowed cheeks. Some women bowed their heads as though in prayer, their shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Others chewed slowly, stretching every bite as if the food might disappear if consumed too quickly. The contrast was almost unbearable. Conquerors carving meat for the conquered, enemies breaking bread in the candlelight. To taste butter after years of substitutes was to awaken memories of a life that had vanished. Some wept not for joy, but for grief, grief for families lost, homes destroyed, a world that no longer existed. Yet alongside grief came shame. To accept kindness from those once painted as monsters was to admit that the stories drilled into them had been false. Propaganda had promised cruelty. Instead, mercy arrived disguised as gravy and bread. The collapse of those lies left women exposed, their pride stripped bare. One whispered bitterly, "If my husband could see me now," and pushed her plate away, unable to continue. Another muttered, "It feels like surrender," though her trembling hands still clutched the bread. Across the room, laughter rippled unexpectedly. A soldier had cracked a joke about the turkey being cooked twice, once in the field and again in the oven. At first, no one reacted. Then a young woman stifled a chuckle, startled by the sound of her own voice. Others followed, tentative, as though laughter itself was forbidden. The noise spread awkwardly, fragile but real. For a moment, the hall no longer felt like a prison, but like a gathering of weary souls daring to remember they were human. The soldiers noticed the shift too. Some watched in silence, unsure what to make of the tears and laughter. A few looked uncomfortable, muttering that feeding Germans felt like rewarding the enemy. Yet others shrugged, reminding themselves it was Thanksgiving, and kindness cost little compared to blood already spilled. One GI leaned against the wall and whispered, "They look like my sisters would if the war had come to our farm." His words carried no hatred, only recognition. Every emotion in that hall clashed against another. Relief against guilt, hunger against pride, mercy against memory. Some women devoured every bite with desperation, tears falling into their plates. Others forced themselves to eat slowly, each swallow heavy with humiliation. The food filled stomachs but emptied illusions. If Americans could be merciful, what else had been lies? If the enemy could feed them, what did that say about all the hatred they had carried? The cracks in propaganda widened with each bite. For years they had been told Americans were beasts, incapable of compassion. Posters had shown caricatures with knives and bloodied grins. Teachers had warned children that capture meant torture. Now, instead of cruelty, they tasted tenderness disguised as food. The dissonance rattled their minds. Belief had been absolute, but reality now argued otherwise, quietly, persuasively, bite by bite. By the end of the meal, the air carried a strange stillness. Stomachs were full, yet no one felt peace. The women had been fed, yes, but at a price heavier than hunger. To eat was to admit weakness. To cry was to confess deception. Their tears did not erase grief, they amplified it. Soldiers, too, carried conflict in their eyes. They had lost comrades, buried friends, endured horrors. And yet here they stood, feeding those once considered enemies. The hall emptied slowly, candlelight flickering against stone walls. The women carried the taste with them back to their bunks. Some whispered about the kindness, daring to question old beliefs. Others stayed silent, unwilling to surrender even in thought. But none could deny what their bodies knew. The enemy had fed them, and the food had been real. The propaganda that had armed them for years now cracked under the simplest weapon, kindness. And once cracks appeared, walls could never stand the same again. While the women wrestled with tears and shame, the soldiers faced conflicts of their own. For them, the act of serving Turkey was not simple charity. It stirred memories, sharpened losses, and challenged convictions carried through the long march of war. Some GIs muttered complaints as they ladled gravy or placed bread on plates. "Why feed the enemy?" one asked under his breath. "My buddy died in the Hurtgen, and now I'm carving turkey for the people who cheered when he fell." The bitterness was sharp, raw, and not easily silenced. Many had buried comrades across France and Belgium. They carried shrapnel in their flesh, scars on their arms, nightmares in their minds. To them, kindness toward Germans felt like betrayal. Others, though, hesitated. They looked across the tables and saw not monsters, but weary women, many not much older than their own sisters. Their patched dresses, hollow cheeks, and trembling hands did not match the propaganda that had painted Germans as merciless beasts. Recognition stirred in unexpected ways. One soldier from Kansas admitted later, "I thought I hated them, but when you see tears over a piece of turkey, you realize hate's a heavy thing to carry." Still, unease lingered. Feeding German prisoners was not simply sentiment. It was policy. American officers understood the value of mercy. They knew the Soviets treated prisoners with brutality. By contrast, the United States wanted to be remembered differently. Food was not only nourishment, but strategy. A full stomach could soften hostility, weaken propaganda, and plant seeds for future alliances. The soldiers carried out the orders, some reluctantly, others with quiet acceptance, recognizing that victory was not only won on battlefields, but also in hearts. In the mess hall that night, the contrast was visible even among the servers. One private joked awkwardly to mask discomfort. Another stood stiff, refusing to look prisoners in the eye. Yet a corporal bent low to place bread gently on a plate, muttering a soft word the woman did not understand. Each gesture revealed the struggle of men caught between vengeance and compassion. The younger soldiers felt it most keenly. Many were barely 20 themselves, scarcely older than the women they served. They thought of their farms in Iowa, their small-town homes in Ohio, the sisters waiting back in Michigan. Looking at the German prisoners, they glimpsed what their own families might have looked like if war had swept across America instead of Europe. That thought unsettled them more than any regulation. And so the hall became a mirror. On one side sat women who had been told Americans were monsters. On the other stood soldiers who had been told Germans were irredeemable. Between them lay platters of turkey, bowls of potatoes, and baskets of bread. Ordinary food that carried extraordinary weight. Each bite chewed away at certainty. Each plate served chipped at walls of hatred. Yet not all wounds could be softened. A lieutenant wrote to his wife that December, "It's easier to fight them when they look like shadows in a field, harder when they sit across a table crying into their food." His words revealed the conflict in every heart that stood in that hall. Mercy unsettled as much as cruelty. When the candles guttered low and the meal ended, the soldiers returned to their quarters, as conflicted as the women they had served. They had followed orders, yes, but also confronted a truth harder than any battlefield. Enemies could look like family, and kindness could wound more deeply than hate. The turkey was gone, the potatoes scraped clean, the bread baskets emptied. Yet what lingered in the hall was heavier than food. The women sat back from the tables, their stomachs full for the first time in years, and discovered that fullness could wound as deeply as hunger. They had swallowed not only meat and bread, but also the collapse of a world carefully constructed by propaganda. For years they had been told that Americans were beasts. Posters had shown tall men with grinning jaws, knives dripping with blood. Teachers had warned children that capture meant torture, starvation, and shame. Propaganda Minister Goebbels had hammered the message in speech after speech. The Allies would destroy, degrade, and defile. These lessons were not abstract. They had been memorized in schools, whispered in bomb shelters, repeated like grim scripture while bombs thundered overhead. One woman recalled her teacher insisting that American soldiers would carve swastikas into German children's foreheads. She remembered trembling at the thought, believing every word. Another recalled listening to broadcasts that described the Allies as mongrels incapable of honor. They had carried these fears into captivity like heavy stones. And yet, the feast told a different story. The soldiers had not starved them. They had not mocked them. They had not poisoned the food. Instead, they had filled plates, carved meat, and ladled gravy. The contradiction was devastating. Every bite chewed away at certainty. Butter melted on bread spoke louder than slogans. Warmth in the stomach lasted longer than cold warnings. The body accepted what the mind could not. Tears were dangerous, not only because they revealed weakness, but because they revealed truth. One woman, a former party loyalist, pressed her sleeve to her face and whispered, "All those years they told us." Her sentence trailed off unfinished, but her silence spoke louder than words. Others nodded, ashamed to admit it aloud, yet unable to deny what their senses confirmed. The women were not alone in their disorientation. The soldiers, too, felt the ground shift beneath them. They had been taught to view Germans as fanatics, enemies to the last breath. Yet the sight of women crying over Turkey unsettled them. One corporal scribbled in his journal, "They cried when they ate." It was the strangest sight. I think the war ended for them at that table. For me, too, maybe. Propaganda thrived on distance. It painted enemies as shadows, faceless and monstrous. But distance collapsed when food crossed the table. A woman clutching a bread roll with trembling hands did not look like a monster. She looked like a mother, a sister, a neighbor. Recognition pierced through the armor of lies. The collapse of propaganda did not happen with explosions or speeches. It happened quietly, with gravy steaming on plates and tears falling into mashed potatoes. It was harder to hate a man who offered you bread, harder to despise a woman whose eyes glistened with gratitude and shame. In that hall, certainty dissolved bite by bite. Whispers spread in the barracks after the meal. Some women described the turkey with reverence, savoring every detail: the crisp skin, the tender meat, the richness of the gravy. Others confessed they had cried without knowing why. None dared call it kindness, not openly, but all admitted it had been different from what they had been taught to expect. Confusion became a new kind of hunger. If the enemy could feed them, what else had been lies? If mercy could be found in those they were told to hate, then what did that mean about themselves? One young woman whispered to her bunkmate, "If they are human, then what have we been?" The question echoed like a bell in the silence of the barracks, heavy and unanswered. Outside the camp, ruins still smoldered, families still scavenged for scraps, children still fainted from hunger. Yet inside, behind barbed wire, the prisoners had tasted something impossible to forget. The food filled their bellies, but the collapse of propaganda filled their minds with unease. Certainty had cracked, and cracks, once made, could never be sealed again. The Thanksgiving feast was not only a spontaneous act of generosity, it was also policy, subtle but deliberate. By late 1945, American officers understood that mercy could be wielded as a weapon more powerful than bullets. The Soviet Union's treatment of prisoners was notorious. Harsh camps, forced labor, starvation without mercy. The United States, by contrast, sought to distinguish itself. Feeding the defeated was not just charity, it was strategy. Food was power in a starving continent. Across Germany, daily rations for civilians had plummeted to barely a fraction of what was needed to survive. Reports described children fainting in classrooms, women collapsing in bread lines, families burning furniture for warmth. Hunger was everywhere, gnawing at the edges of survival. Against this backdrop, a full plate of turkey was more than a meal. It was a statement, America could destroy, but it could also feed. Truman's administration recognized the value in that message. Mercy softened resistance where threats could not. A prisoner who left a camp alive and fed might later become a citizen, less inclined to rebel against Allied occupation. A starving captive, by contrast, would carry hatred into whatever future survived. The Marshall Plan was still 2 years away, but its philosophy had already sprouted. Stability required more than guns. It required bread. Not all soldiers saw it that way. Some still grumbled, bitter that the enemy who cheered their comrades' deaths now chewed American turkey. Yet others, standing in the flickering light of the mess hall, recognized the wisdom behind the gesture. To feed was to disarm. To nourish was to plant seeds of doubt in minds poisoned by lies. For the women, the meal dismantled propaganda in ways no pamphlet ever could. Butter melting on bread, potatoes thick with gravy, turkey seasoned with sage. These carried truths stronger than speeches. They could not reconcile the food before them with the images drilled into their heads. The contradictions worked silently, burrowing deeper than any lecture or sermon. Historians later noted that millions survived the winter of 1945–46 because Allied shipments of wheat, powdered milk, and canned meat kept famine at bay. Yet statistics could not capture what unfolded in that Rhineland mess hall. Policy became personal. Numbers became faces. Strategy became tears shed over turkey. The officers who watched understood the double meaning. Feeding the women was both compassion and calculation. They had expected gratitude, perhaps relief, but not the flood of tears that followed. What they witnessed was something far stronger. The crumbling of a wall built by years of lies. Mercy, whether born of strategy or sentiment, had achieved what bombs and bayonets could not. It had reached the human heart. And once touched, the heart could never wholly return to the certainties of hate. When the women left the mess hall that night, their bellies were full, but their minds churned with questions. They carried the taste of turkey like an ember tucked inside their chests. Warm, unsettling, impossible to ignore. Back in the barracks, whispers replaced silence. Some spoke of the turkey with reverence, describing its golden skin, its juices rich with butter. Others recalled the bread so soft it seemed unreal after years of hardness. A few admitted, with embarrassed honesty, that they had cried without knowing why. The meal did not erase grief. Husbands remained buried on foreign fronts. Children lost to bombs would not return. Cities reduced to rubble still stood in ruins. Yet something had shifted. For the first time, the Americans no longer appeared only as faceless enemies. They were men who carved meat, men who joked about dry turkey, men who looked at prisoners not with cruelty, but with unease that resembled compassion. In the weeks that followed, gestures multiplied. A soldier slipped a cigarette to a woman, who accepted it with trembling hands. Another dropped a chocolate bar by accident, and the women shared it piece by piece as though it were sacred. Laughter broke out over spilled coffee, a sound so foreign it startled everyone in the room. Small acts stitched fragile threads of recognition, thin but impossible to tear away. Years later, in oral history projects, some of the women testified that the Thanksgiving dinner marked the true end of the war for them. One recalled, voice wavering, "I believed everything they told us, that Americans would treat us like animals. And then that night I ate turkey and cried. I cried because I realized I had been lied to all my life." Her words revealed what no statistic could. Wars end not only with treaties, but in the human heart. The meal outlived the ruins, outlived the winter, outlived the silence of captivity. It became memory, retold with tears decades later. A story not of victory or surrender, but of reconciliation born in the simplest of places. A table, a plate, a slice of turkey shared between conqueror and conquered. The war had ended on paper months before, yet in that Rhineland hall, something deeper ended over turkey and tears. Propaganda collapsed not with speeches, but with butter melting on bread. Mercy revealed what hate had hidden, that enemies could also be human. The women carried that truth into uncertain futures, and the soldiers never forgot the sight of tears falling over a simple meal. If stories like this move you, where history bleeds into humanity, subscribe to Requiem of Fear and share your thoughts below. Join us as we uncover more forgotten shadows of the past.